So good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming. My name is Derek Olson. I'm the president of WorldOregon, and it's an honor to have with us today a fantastic speaker who I'll introduce in just a minute. I just wanted to update you on a couple things that are coming up soon for our events. Tim is out sick today. He sends his best. I think he's going to be watching it live streaming like other people do, and but he can't make it here, so he sends his best. Wanted to highlight just a couple of the upcoming events. They're on our website, or if you're not already, on our e-newsletter. But we're excited. I'll talk about some of the upcoming great decisions in just a minute. But the other speakers that we have in the next couple days, we have our young professionals have a program next Tuesday with the Portland International Film Festival. And then on March 1st, we have a great event coming up on U.S.-Japan relations. We have several experts coming in from the East Coast for that. It should be a really good event. We're partnering with the Japan-America Society of Oregon. That's at noon in our offices over adjacent to the Oregon Historical Society. Again, that's March 1st. And then we have an event coming up on North Korea that Tim, because he's very creative, has entitled Networks, Nukes in North Korea, or How You Might Learn to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. I'm not so sure about that, but I think it'll be good for an audience. So that should be, there's a Reed professor who's talking, again, that's March 22nd in our offices. And then we have some other interesting things that you'll see coming up later this spring. We're partnering with Mercy Corps on something on Sudan, with Mel Gertoff from Portland State here on peacemaking, and a program in the works in April on jazz and diplomacy. So more details to come on that. Our big news, which I know Tim has been highlighting, is our International Speaker Series, which kicks off on March 20th with Lulu Garcia-Navarro from NPR's Sunday Weekend Edition, and includes David Frum, Evan Osnos, and Masha Gessen. We have up here the proof of what's at the printers. I mean, we've been doing, you've seen it on email, but this is the hard copy postcard that will be handed out. Things got a little delayed because we had a switch, as you might have seen in the first date, so apologize. If you've already bought tickets, fantastic. Thanks for your vote of confidence, and the tickets will be mailed out shortly by Portland 5, we're hoping next week. If you haven't bought tickets, they're on sale in person, online, or on the phone from Portland 5. The series is called Matters of Fact. And we're really trying to look at the importance of journalism and writing and telling the truth in very turbulent times. We're very excited about the lineup. I think it's a really dynamic one and some real firsts as kind of different backgrounds we have for our speakers, so we're really excited. Anyways, details on the lineup are on our website, and again, tickets are through Portland 5, who we're partnering with at the Schnitz. And then upcoming for great decisions, we have two more talks coming up after this one. On March 2nd is on global health. That will be followed by a conference for teachers that we're doing. So if you know teachers that are interested in that topic, there's a flyer here. We're going to have sort of a small workshop after that session just for teachers only. And then on March 9th, we're going to close out the series with a talk on South Africa, with a retired ambassador who's down at the University of Oregon. Today's talk is on China and America, the new geopolitical equation. And really, again, it's an honor to have David Kohl be our presenter today. He is a friend and an expert on issues of trade and ties with China. I'm going to give you some of the highlight of his resume and give you a sense of the expertise he's built up over a career working on this. He graduated from UVO's College of Business, studied in Beijing at the University of International Business and Economics and Beijing Language and Culture University. Also has a Master's of International Management right here from PSU. He's held a number of jobs related to this work, including being a cross-cultural consultant both with Nike and the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, Director of International Policy for Northwest Christian University. He has his own consulting firm called D.W. Kohl Cultural Intelligence. He's an adjunct professor with the University of Portland for many years in their school of business, and he's brought student groups to China. And since 2011, he has been working with the Oregon Small Business Network as a statewide international trade liaison. And that's where I got to know David through his work there, and he's a past president of the Northwest China Council. as well as a volunteer member of what's called the District Export of Council of Oregon. So in many ways, he's helped small and medium-sized businesses try to get into the international market, specifically in East Asia, even more specifically in China. So he's really a tremendous local resource, and it's an honor to have him here. And without further ado, we're going to turn it over to David. Big hand applause for our speaker.
Well, thank you, Derek. Yeah, you're too kind, but I appreciate being here. It's a real honor and a privilege to be with you and to discuss this topic. It's a very complex and deep topic, so I'm going to do what I can to be succinct so we can have more of a dynamic discussion later on. Definitely could do a full day seminar and it would just still barely scratch the surface. So anyway, so I took a few notes to try and keep me on track, so if you'll bear with me, I'm going to try to stay on track. So yeah, discussing the geopolitical landscape that is affecting relationship between China and the US. It's definitely something that a lot of people are thinking about now, and in my opinion is a very important relationship to maintain appropriately. I also want to state that the opinions that I share here are not necessarily the opinions of the agencies or organizations that I work with, and so I get to feel free to speak what's on my mind, which is always kind of nice. Okay, so as Derek said, I've spent the last 20 years or so engaging professionally in facilitating a better understanding between China and the US. I've done that with multinationals in China. I lived in Beijing from 1999 to 2002 before I came back to study here at PSU. It seemed a little strange to leave China to learn about China, but it actually was very useful. Okay. Oh, that's much louder. So while I was in China, I worked with a lot of multinational companies, corporations that were interested in establishing offices there. And it was an exercise in localizing management because obviously it's good to have people on the ground there that are local and familiar with how things work to be able to successfully represent large organizations. I also worked with Chinese domestic companies as well, where they were interested in understanding Western or American culture and ways of doing business. Definitely there was a recognition as they were engaging more and more with foreign entities that they needed to become more familiar with how things were done and what to expect. It's been interesting to see how there's become a kind of a balance. At that time, China was very interested in becoming more involved in international affairs, business-wise and politically, and that was an interesting experience for me. I also trained Chinese staff at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing for a couple of years. I was there when 9/11 happened, when the Hainan spy plane incident happened, and had a number of students at that time, so it really created some interesting discussion, interesting context. So I'm pretty fortunate to have been raised in a multicultural environment. My mother's from Hong Kong, she's right over here, and my father's from Montana. So a little bit of a different cultural influence, but my father was department head of East Asian Studies at the University of Oregon for most of my life, and so I was exposed to a lot of Asian-related culture, was able to travel a lot when I was young, lived in Japan, spent a lot of time in Hong Kong, and that really that's been really good for me in terms of my parents encouraging diversity and multiplicity with regards to the way people think and the way people interact. So I've always kind of been a bridge as an adult, I became more specifically a bridge between China and the US, trying to facilitate better understanding and hopefully friendly relations. So, let's see. Yeah, at that time, when I was in Hong Kong, it was always very exciting for me, traveling to Hong Kong to see relatives. Hong Kong at that time was, really a spectacular place. It was still a British colony, and it was just lavish and glittering pearl in the Pacific. Coming from Eugene, it always seemed very sophisticated and advanced, forward-thinking. You'd see Lamborghinis parked on the street, and as a young boy, that really struck me. And at that time, mainland China was quite different from Hong Kong with regards to general society and economically. Hong Kongers tended to not consider themselves to be part of mainland China. And there was a lot of efforts, I remember it striking me that there was a lot of efforts to try and keep mainland Chinese from sneaking in as refugees, basically, from mainland China. That clearly has changed, and that's an interesting thing to witness. So, yeah, it really was interesting to see the shift in attitude of my relatives in Hong Kong. As a young adult, I did have a chance to travel around. Well, as a teen, I had a chance to travel around mainland China on tours and kind of get a general idea of the landscape. But as a young adult, I did work in mainland China representing a Hong Kong company and traveling around the country with state-owned antiquities experts. And that was really interesting because we went into small villages and went to a lot of places that tourists probably wouldn't go to. And it really opened my eyes. I felt, this was 1997, so right when Hong Kong went back to mainland China. And I could just tell at that time that I really needed to better understand what was going on in China. I wanted to learn the language so that I could actually understand a little bit, at least, of what was going on. And it just seemed to me that that was a place where a lot of interesting things were going to happen over the next couple decades, and it has. So I came back to Portland, and then very quickly decided that I wanted to move to China indefinitely. I moved to Beijing in 1999 and ended up staying there for about 3 years full time, as I mentioned before. So even though I have a fairly limited experience going back to the mid-90s or so with China, I am feeling fortunate that I was able to witness and experience a humble China at that time. Being a foreigner in Beijing, kind of treated like a celebrity of sorts. Got away with a lot of stuff, and people were really nice to me just for being a foreigner, honestly. And it was a little unsettling, but it was interesting. As I was teaching in various groups, schools, and companies and whatnot, there was a great interest in the students trying to understand American perspective, and there really was a sense that a lot of these Chinese citizens wanted to be more like Americans. And that's a really general statement, and maybe not politically correct, but it really was the case to some degree. The gradual influx of more Western and particularly American popular culture was fascinating to people. At that time, they would have a list of 4 movies that were allowed to play, Western movies, and they would show those at regular intervals, and people would attend in droves. I remember seeing a couple of newly released Western movies that were dubbed into Chinese, and so I couldn't really tell what was going on too much, other than the general common storylines that tend to repeat themselves in movies. One thing that really struck me, though, was that some of my Chinese friends and students, well, one in particular, one day as we were a group having lunch, mentioned that China really needs the help of the U.S. right now. They're like an older brother, Da Ge, and that was all well and good, but someday China would grow again, and when they came into power, then we would see what was what. And that was a little bit disturbing, but I understood what he meant. And we're kind of seeing that now as China comes to prominence and to power and influence, and it is affecting China-US relations. So it's very important that both countries understand each other and get along well for the betterment of both China and the US, but the world in general. So I understand you've read an article that was distributed, and it's a very interesting article that brings up a lot of topics and issues. But one of them is that China has really started to engage more and more with the rest of the world, moving kind of more from an inward-facing society or culture, policy-wise, to really actively engaging with other parts of the world, in particular other developing countries. And that's an interesting thing that's happening, because the US has traditionally been involved in foreign aid and in foreign engagement in China, and now the US is kind of stepping back from a lot of that. And China is engaging more and more, but they are different ways, different approaches to this engagement. And so that's an area where I think it's important that the US still is engaged in foreign aid, and doing so in an effective manner. China seems to be a little bit more, they engage more holistically as a developing country. They still consider themselves a developing country to some degree, and so going into some of these other developing countries creates opportunities for China to acquire resources, knowledge, and develop relationships that will also suit China. And the US seems to consider foreign aid, foreign engagement to be, foreign engagement in that sense, to be kind of an extra thing that's not part of the regular standard. It's an add-on to our policy. And so it seems that it's easy to say, okay, well, we can pull back from that, and that's, it's not going to affect things for the United States too much, because that's kind of just an extra. It's charitable. But we need to understand and make sure that we still remain engaged with the rest of the world, and that's something that does seem to be shifting. So yeah, the US is backed, an example of that, the US is backed off of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and but it looks like Japan is still going to move forward with that without the United States, which is unfortunate from the fact that the US is backed off of TPP, just because starting to be more inward-facing and insular, I don't think is in the best interest of the United States personally. So So as I said, China is moving forward with several initiatives to engage with the world and to establish itself as a global leader. The One Belt, One Road initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, are good examples of that. Now, does this mean that China is becoming the main influencer globally and that the US influence is waning? Well, that's a matter of opinion, and I would love to hear what you guys have to think about that shortly. How much concern should this be for the US? I think the issue really is not so cut and dried. It seems that China is trying to establish more of a power-based world order, with China being at the top, being an influencer, and other countries, for lack of a better word, paying tribute to China as they become a power-based leader in a power-based world order. The US, on the other hand, has been more of a, they've withdrawn from global infrastructure, but they tend to be focused, or we have tend to be focused on more of a rule-based world order, which is very different from a power-based world order, where soft power is the basis for influence. Joseph Nye from Harvard stated that soft power and culture influence is a more important element than economic, military, or political power. To me, it seems that most of the world would prefer a rule-based order rather than a power-based one, but again, that's my perception and my opinion, and that's not necessarily the case. We'll see how that goes. But I do feel that the US can still be the global leader through soft power. American pop culture is still pervasive throughout the world and is still highly valued and influential. An example is, after World War II, some in Japan were famously quoted as stating that they didn't necessarily want democracy as much as they wanted burgers and Cokes. And I don't know how I feel about that, but in China, I've definitely seen that too, with Starbucks coming in and a number of cultural influences that seemed a little odd to me at times. I would literally go to tutor executives in large Chinese companies, and they would have posters of Britney Spears on their wall and were very seriously fans. And more power to them, but it was very different from the perspective that I had in the US. So, other countries may agree or disagree with US policy, but in my opinion, US culture still has considerable influence. In my experience, many Chinese aspire to be Americans, or to live like Americans, but to what extent and how has that changed? Because I'm definitely seeing a shift where culture is moving back to China, within China, as a source of influence. And there may be some backlash publicly with regards to popular US culture being spread in China, but again, I still think that people are interested in Columbia sportswear jackets and wearing Nike shoes and the NBA, and we see a lot of things that the US or Chinese people would gather from the US that are now spreading to China, and China's putting their own spin on things, and I think that's a good thing. China's no doubt a significant global player and an influencer, and they have many aspirations in many fields. But to what end? And that's something that is important for us to understand, for the US to truly understand what these aspirations truly are and what China is really trying to achieve. Yeah, this has often been a challenge culturally for Americans who usually have an agenda, built a case for it, and then defend ferociously. That's something that I've worked with American negotiating teams going to China, where I had to stress that instead of building your case, making it watertight, going, defending it, if there's objections, go back, change it a little bit, go defend it, and keep doing that until you come to an agreement. But the Chinese way is a little more collective and dynamic. So what would really bother a lot of American negotiating teams was the idea that, well, we'll come to an agreement, we'll sign a contract, and then it changes over time. And that was very disturbing to a lot of American business people. But I tried to provide the perspective that Chinese is a more collective and high context society or culture, felt that that was a natural way to build cooperation and long-term understanding. That, of course, in a joint venture, the reason two parties are coming together is because each side has something that the other wants, or one side understands certain things and the other side understands certain things. So coming together in a cooperative, high context partnership is marked by the fact that as you proceed down the road of your project, that as things come up, you'll make adjustments. And it's not just a static thing that you figure out in advance and hope it carries through successfully. That's still something that I think is difficult for a lot of American negotiating teams. So fear of China's rise runs rampant throughout the US. I definitely saw that when I came back from China. I would be, as a proponent of friendly relations and better understanding, I was often upset by listening to people speak on television, on CNN, or a host of other news and talk shows, that China was a real danger at that time. And to me, it just seemed like fear-mongering, and it was not always very accurate. And the experts that would often moderate these, couple of people kind of bashing on each other, they were frustrated as well. So that was something that was a concern for me. But it's definitely something that is happening now. China is steadily building out its military capability. It has an aircraft carrier and more coming. That seems to freak out a lot of people, for lack of a better word. But in my opinion, there's no way China is going to catch the US in terms of military might. And their focus, I think, in my opinion, seems to be more on technologies that will mitigate potential offensive actions against them, like air-to-air missiles, and developing other technologies to basically defend themselves. I don't see China as a threat to the US in terms of wanting to invade the US, or something like that. That's craziness in my opinion. That's just not going to happen. So as we wallow in this fear and kind of withdraw and try and protect ourselves, China has been steadily going out into the world and trying to develop long-term relationships that will serve them well. And I think that's pretty much a wise approach. So what does that mean for US policy towards China? Consistent with traditional Chinese culture, China wants a reliable and consistent group of friends and allies. They want the relationship to be long-term and not erratic. And that's something that I think we're being challenged with now as we develop new policies. In particular, well, the article that you read basically does state that China has no confidence in White House personnel, the State Department, the Defense Department, the Commerce Department, that there's political appointees coming in for some, and long-standing personnel are not engaged anymore, and that throws off a Chinese government that does want to have long-term and reliable means of communication, because that's how you develop long-term cooperation and friendship. A lot of the posts are not even filled. So that's something that I think can be an issue. The removal of these key players is an issue. Again, in the article, it talks about how Beijing sees Washington as gridlocked at home and increasingly alienated from traditional friends in the international arena, that the world is moving into a post-American era. And so the question remains, what will Xi Jinping's future foreign policy be? How can the US increase its influence? And how can Washington influence them? And how can the US create its own comprehensive power in conjunction with the rise of China? Xi Jinping stresses national dignity and great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. They are challenged, however, by growing unrest in China due to capital controls and a disaffected intellectual group. There's a lot of pride in China, but there's definitely a lot of movement of money coming to the West to hedge against potential social issues in China. China definitely has a lot of challenges to deal with, and it'll be interesting to see how that comes forth. So, an example of some of these changes and these shifts, and then I want to get into more of an interactive discussion. In 2016, China was the leading trade partner of 124 countries versus 76 countries for the US. And that's a complete reversal from 10 years ago. The US National Science Foundation reported that scientific publications from China in 2016 outnumbered those from the US for the first time ever, from 426,000 from China versus 409,000 from the US. So this idea that research and development or a movement forward in the ability to not rely on the United States or other Western intellectuals is definitely growing. You know, we see some fear coming back against some of that. Huawei and, you know, a couple of other companies that are involved with cell phone manufacturing and things like that have really had some problems here in the United States recently. Verizon and AT&T and a lot of the other carriers have agreed under US pressure to not distribute those phones for fear that it's something that would compromise US security interests. And that may or may not be true, but it does send a signal that we are pulling back and afraid, and it's not necessarily the best message to put out there. There's been significant advances in the fields of artificial intelligence, space technology. I mean, even back when I was engaging more in China, I had a friend that their business was to launch satellites for other countries like France and others, because they could do it, and for the most part, and these other countries were challenged by that. So even back then, there was a lot of ability to do technological things despite the opinion that China was still developing its ability to think on its own and not just copycat the rest of the world. That's definitely changed now, I feel. So I'd like to take some time to have you talk about what you think is important to discuss or your opinions on any of these subjects, on the article itself, and I'd like to engage in a dynamic discussion. So. Looks like we have some questions over here.
Thanks, David. We will go over here. Just a reminder, we are live streaming this, and so all questions need to be in the microphone, not only for the benefit of those in the audience, but for our online listeners. So we'll start here in the front row.
Thank you. It's not hard to think up a list of U.S. allies, both culturally and economically, Great Britain, Germany, France, Australia, Canada, that share a common worldview and et cetera, and interests largely. Who would you put on that list for China?
Well, that's a good question. It seems that China has always traditionally been a friend of and a cooperative partner with Russia. And being in the news quite a bit, that China has a relationship with North Korea. That's definitely an interesting subject that we could talk a lot about. But China is definitely trying to, through the One Belt, One Road initiative, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, to try and create mechanisms for increased cooperation and trade within the region. That's being met with mixed feelings, I think. A lot of countries in East Asia, in that region, do feel threatened to some degree that China is shifting a power balance that they'd become used to. So that's an interesting area that we'll see how that goes. What do you think about that?
Well, the reason I ask that is that despite what's going on in Washington now and their approach to how they deal with our erstwhile allies, I mean, sure, China is trying to develop the new Silk Road and so on. So they're working on deals, but who can they actually count on to be their friends? Which is different in terms of deals.
Absolutely, and that's something that I've had a lot of discussions about as China moves into, African countries providing aid, building infrastructure projects that ostensibly will help those regions, and they probably do to some extent, but there seems to be some resentment there. So how successful they are with regards to developing friendly allies that are not feeling, will take the development but feel threatened and a little bit resentful of the way that China operates with regards to this power-based world order rather than the way the United States provides aid, for example.
And just a reminder on North Korea, we're going to have a talk, as I mentioned, on March 22nd that'll dive more into that. We're going to take one more question in the front row and then move back and then I'll circle around.
Over the past few decades, I've seen two countries in Asia, Taiwan and South Korea, that evolved from dictatorships into rather well-functioning democracies, and I feel the main impetus for this was affluence in the middle class. You had leisure time in that. Do you see that happening in China and for any social liberalization?
Oh, definitely. There is definitely a rising middle class in China, but despite that, China has a lot of people, and there's a huge spectrum of the way that Chinese people live. Being in Beijing, that was much different than seeing what was going on in some of these other parts of the country. When I was working with middle managers in China that were trying to take leadership positions in these multinational corporations, they were challenged. I'd be in an office, modern office building, with highly educated Chinese people that were very smart, dressed very well, and were very capable in doing the work. But I also saw that they were very much challenged with regards to trying to be seen as middle class and upwardly mobile. So, with Starbucks coming in and with a number of other cultural influences coming in, it was difficult. I'd see this manager working. They work for very little at that time, but they had this social pressure to still go and buy a $4 Starbucks or a $7 cocktail just to show that they were in this emerging class. But that was very difficult financially. That has also changed quite a bit, and there's huge wealth that's been generated in China. We see that with investment coming into the United States, but how well it's spread out and how stable the growth of middle class is, I think, is a key element to social stability there. So, yeah, that's an interesting question.
Is this turned on? Oh, okay, yes, I can hear myself. Well, thank you for that rare perspective. It brings back some memories from 1995, yes. It seems such a long time ago. My first visit to Beijing and subsequent visits, I was really impressed, to understate the term, by the year-to-year increase in wealth that you referred to. It's just fantastic. Two things. One, of course, this talk is about the relationship between China and US, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on the relationship with the neighbors to the north, south, and west, east, and west. And if that might play a role in the future of China's rise, continued rise. And the second question is, I think there is insufficient appreciation of the role of US in the rise of China, especially in the 80s and 90s. I have never, in all of history, I have never known a country that provided the capital, the know-how, and most importantly, the markets for a potential rival. And that's what the US did. I just cannot think of any case in history of that happening. Many other questions come to mind, but I think we'll go with that.
Well, yes, that again, the relationship that China has with its neighbors, how that is yet to be seen. I think there's an interest in having more global influential power in that region, whether it be through the United States' presence there or through China. I think there's mixed feelings. A lot of countries in that region are a little bit concerned about China's rise in terms of military power and in terms of their outlook with regards to influencing these other countries. And so the US being, having such a large presence in South Korea and other areas there is of concern to China. But that's where I think our policies, respectively, China's and the United States, will determine how that moves forward, where the needle goes on that. And then, as you mentioned about the United States, with financial investment into the country, really facilitated a growth in their ability to engage with the rest of the world and become more affluent as a country, I guess. It always struck me, I remember when China was lobbying to get into the WTO, and that was a big deal to the United States and to other countries. China was not as robust economically as it is now, obviously. But I found it somewhat ironic that one of the conditions that was imposed on China was to clean up their human rights abuses and to change their behavior with regards to human rights in general. And when China was admitted into the World Trade Organization, that opened up foreign direct investment into China. The US said, we won't do this until you clean up your human rights issues, and then promptly invested a lot of money, which ironically ended up displacing thousands and thousands of farmers that had traditionally been making their living through farming, and the government just took all that land and provided it for greenfield investment of multinational corporations with tax incentives, and that caused a lot of social, a lot of difficulty for a lot of people. So that was an ironic, an interesting thing to witness or to be aware of.
Aside from the power approach that you mentioned that concerns a lot of the neighbors and around China, the impact, the positive impact that American culture and lifestyle, which has appeal to the general Chinese population, has that same impact of the Chinese culture had any appeal for any other countries similar to what we have had on them?
So other countries besides the United States?
Yeah, I mean, they look upon China with the kind of lifestyle choices and the cultural aspects and elements of it that has had a favorable impact on them, so now they're emulating some of those Chinese cultural aspects?
Well, yeah, I would say so to some degree. I think that in terms of cultural influence, South Korea and Japan are still mavens for what is popular with regards to entertainment, with regards to fashion, with regards to lifestyle. I'm not really, I can't really think of too much that is inherently Chinese that's influencing their neighbors other than the fact that there's been a dramatic rise economically. But we did see that with the tiger countries, you know, decades earlier. So, yeah, I'd be interested to hear, are you referencing anything in particular?
No, I have no idea.
Well, I think that's a challenge for China to basically ingratiate themselves to the rest of that region and to, as they're developing this infrastructure, to really be seen in a positive light in terms of how they can influence lifestyle in particular. But people are seeing, you know, billionaires being created. I mean, there's a lot of new billionaires in China, but they seem to be set aside from the rest of the population, and it is it was very obvious and blatant for some time. I remember bringing students there a lot, and you know, talking with my friends that lived there, that there would be events that were catered towards new billionaires that, by their own admission, didn't really know how to be a wealthy person correctly. They wanted their children to know, and for sure that for sure they do, but there would be these events put on by groups of companies that would teach people how to be wealthy. And you know, it'd be at this golf resort, you use this equipment, you drive this kind of vehicle, you wear these kind of clothes, you drink this kind of champagne or liquor, and it was a very interesting thing to witness and to experience. But now, with the millennial generation, it's very different, where I think a lot of these young Chinese people are growing up with an understanding of how to be similar in terms of lifestyle and attitude and opinion, but with Chinese characteristics. So it's interesting.
My question is about the northeastern border of China with North Korea. It mentions in the book, and I never thought of that before. They said that they're very careful with what they do with North Korea, because so many people in that area have commerce with that area of North Korea. And do you have any idea how many people are on both sides that far north on those borders?
Well, in terms of population, I'm not. I don't know offhand, but that's definitely a difficult and conflicting situation for China. You know, traditionally have had influence with Korea. They have a trade relationship, and they've been under pressure from other countries, but also even internally recognizing that there's some serious issues in North Korea in terms of global politics. The last thing they want is to destabilize North Korea. And I'm not going to get into it too much because we'll have more discussion with another speaker, but China is trying to find a balance between appeasing the rest of the world with regards to influencing North Korea in a manner that is appreciated by other countries, but at the same time, they do want to maintain a relationship, and they definitely don't want North Korea to destabilize. I mean, among other reasons, that there'll be a flood of refugees coming across. That area of China is not well, there's spots, but it's not a very wealthy part of China. People live very poorly there, but in talking with some of them, they see refugees that have snuck across the border, and they go to live in these villages, and these Chinese that are very poor talk about like, oh, those poor North Koreans. I mean, they're really hurting. So it's all a relative thing.
My question, I guess, is very similar. America obviously is hugely obsessed with the nuclear capabilities of Iran and North Korea. What kind of concerns does Chinese government seem to be predominantly concerned with, I guess, in terms of the nuclear capabilities?
Well, I think the main concern is how to satisfy the United States and other countries with regards to putting pressure on them to get rid of their nuclear program, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. But obviously other countries in the region are very concerned about how the United States might shift its approach to dealing with the North Korea nuclear threat. Because if, as the article talks about, there's 3 different ways to go about it, but if the United States really tries to forcefully, or the rest of the world tries to forcefully remove that government or to physically get rid of nuclear capability, a tremendous number of people will be killed, notably South Korea, Japan. They're just really in the line of fire. There's nothing that would, no matter how effective a group of outside countries is with regards to eliminating that threat, it's impossible to avoid having huge collateral damage. So China, they're close to, but I think they're not as concerned with that element as much as South Korea and Japan do.
Thanks for your presentation. My question to you is concerns more about your observations of American opinions towards the PRC, because my understanding of your background is that you work with people on a daily basis who have to form some kind of opinion on China. So specifically, it seems like there is an increasing fear among the pundit community, among the policymaking elite of the PRC, not only from the traditional threats that are talked about, whether military, economic, or whatever, but recently, for example, the director of the FBI says Chinese society is a threat to the United States. So I wanted to ask you whether that fear is also reflected in the clients that you work with, and if so, what are some of the dystopian scenarios that are in their heads that they tell you about? Thank you.
Well, that's a good question. That's interesting. Where, as I said, I've for most of my career, I've tried to foster positive understanding and positive relationships between the two countries, and I was frustrated as China was growing that there was such concern, and oftentimes not really based in specific facts about China and just this red menace is communism, and they're going to try and take over the world, and that was really not the case. China had a lot of their own issues to deal with, and so that really wasn't a threat at that time. China still has a lot of issues, but that's come back around again, it seems, but with a different basis for feeling that way. I didn't think there was a backlash to China's emergence, and then for a good 10 years, there was a huge interest in China because it was the land of opportunity for a lot of international business people. And so that was interesting, and I worked with a lot of domestic companies here that were engaging with China because they wanted to take advantage of those opportunities. And so they embraced this idea that China is not a threat in that regard, and that having a more friendly relationship and cooperating can lead to economic success for all parties involved. But now in the last 5 years or so, that has shifted back to where there's a lot of fear about what China's agenda is, and instead of them approaching the situation, having the U.S. as an older, big brother that's going to help them out and help them rise out of an economic situation that was not what they wanted, or the middle class didn't want, to now China being so influential that the U.S. is afraid again. And we see that with Huawei and other companies that they have the technology and the capability to provide consumer products here, and the U.S. government is really putting pressure on the significant players to eliminate their ability to effectively spread their technology and send their products to the United States.
What about domestic issues in China? Because after all, it was at one point at least a communist country where they, at least nominally, were interested in the poor. It seems to me that everything you hear about China is their increasing wealth of a few people, their influence, their power influence, the building artificial islands, and that sort of thing. But what about the poor people? Are there any government programs to help out the average, if there is such a thing, an average citizen in China? What's going on domestically?
Well, that's an interesting question that probably goes beyond my ability to answer comprehensively. But Xi Jinping definitely made an effort to try and consolidate power, but also to show or demonstrate that he was serious about getting rid of corruption and trying to level the playing field. It used to really just be a small number of elites that were able to do what they wanted and achieve a lot of financial success. But being flashy with the watches, the Mautai, the big banquets, spending the people's money in a very lavish and obvious fashion. So that's been scaled back to some degree, but it's still definitely, social unrest is really a huge threat to China, in my opinion, still.
Yes, I have a demographic question. In my view of studying China, I've been there a couple of times, the kinship group has been the basis for making China the longest surviving civilization in the world, I think, for many more centuries. And recently, with the coming in of the one-child family, for example, that utterly disrupted the kinship structure. And and now, for example, I understand that there's a shortage of women in China. So the question as to, as with the new China now, will there be any way to resume, restructure to get the old family style that, for example, denied primogeniture so you wouldn't have single individuals or families being able to control lots of land and make other people serfs and so forth. So can you comment on the consequences of the one-child family and how that's going to affect the future survival of China in a new capitalistic system?
Well, you've touched on a very important issue that I feel very strongly about. yes, because of the one-child policy, China is an aging population. That's going to be a huge issue in terms of social security for people, especially moving away from the iron rice bowl, where people maybe didn't have a lot, but everyone had enough. That's definitely a thing. I see, just even because of in rural areas, boys being favored over girls has definitely affected that as well. And I'm terrified for China. The fact that there are shanty towns outside of major cities that are just filled with young, single men that have no money and have no prospects for having a wife or even a girlfriend or anything like that. And if you think about that, having thousands of young men all living smashed together with no hope with regards to having a relationship like that, that's very difficult. And then also, I worked with a lot of these high-level managers in China, and maybe most, they were women, very intelligent, strong, powerful women. And when I talk with them, they'd say, "Oh, I'm going home to cook dinner and do some laundry," and I'd ask them about that, this whole, equal rights, and they, for the most part, were baffled at why we're so concerned with that here, because, they would say, "I'm not doing it because I'm subservient, I'm just better at it, and I want it to be done well." And so a lot of upwardly mobile young women, even if they are technically available, they don't want to have they definitely don't want to marry down, and they don't want to have, they want to focus on their career, so a shortage becomes even more of a shortage. So that's definitely an issue, I think, for China.
Well, we've come to the end of our time, and I know that Dave will be here. If you have a question didn't get time to get asked, come up and he could stay for a couple more minutes. Thank you, everyone, again, for coming. A round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you all.
We will see you next week on Global Health, and information on the International Speaker Series is up at the table. Thanks for coming.